February 10, 1945, 11:50 a.m. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, the pilot of a C-47 transport looked down at endless water and made a decision that would either save 13 lives or doom them all. For almost 5 hours, his plane had been flying through storms with a broken radio. His fuel gauge read empty. His passengers, including 2 Army nurses, had no idea where they were. Then, through a break in the clouds, the pilot saw land. An airstrip. Salvation. He dropped his landing gear and began his approach. What he didn't know was that he was about to hand himself, his crew, and his passengers directly to the Japanese. And the only person who could stop him was an American fighter pilot who would have to make an impossible choice in the next 60 seconds. This is a story about split-second decisions, the chaos of war, and what happens when saving lives means shooting at your own side. If you want more deep dives into the commanders and pilots who faced impossible choices in World War II, hit subscribe. These stories deserve to be told. What happened in the next 2 minutes would become one of the strangest incidents of the Pacific War. A transport plane full of Americans was descending toward a Japanese-controlled airfield. An American fighter pilot watched from above, knowing that if that plane landed, everyone on board would either die or spend the rest of the war in a prison camp. The pilot in the C-47 couldn't hear radio warnings. He couldn't see the danger below. And time was running out. The story begins 3 days earlier with a man named Louis Curdes. He was 25 years old and already one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the Army Air Forces. But Curdes wasn't like other aces. Most fighter pilots focused on racking up kills and building reputations. Curdes focused on surviving and getting the job done. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in North Africa and Italy, where he'd been shot down, captured, and escaped twice before spending 9 months hiding in enemy territory. When he finally made it back to Allied lines, most pilots would have gone home. Curdes volunteered to go to the Pacific. By February 1945, Curdes was flying a P-51 Mustang he'd named Bad Angel. The name fits. He'd already shot down 7 German planes, 1 Italian fighter, and a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. He was one of only 3 American pilots who'd scored kills against all 3 major Axis powers. His fellow pilots respected him. His commanders trusted him. And on February 10th, they gave him a mission that seemed simple enough. Take 3 other P-51s to Batan Island, a small chunk of rock between the Philippines and Taiwan. Intelligence thought the Japanese might be using an airstrip there. Find it, photograph it, and come home. Curdes led his flight of 4 Mustangs north that morning. With him were Lieutenants Schmidtke, Scally, and Lacroix. They were looking for 1 airfield but found 2. When they split up to investigate, Lacroix and Scally discovered a small Japanese base on Batan. They attacked immediately, strafing planes on the ground while calling for help. But the Japanese weren't caught completely off guard. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through Lacroix's P-51. He crash-landed in the ocean just offshore. Curdes and Schmidtke raced to help. While Schmidtke climbed to altitude to call for rescue, Curdes dove back toward the airfield. His job now was to keep Japanese fighters on the ground so they couldn't finish off Lacroix, who was floating in a life raft just a few hundred yards from shore. Curdes made pass after pass over the airfield, his machine guns tearing up anything that moved. The Japanese fired back, but their flak was scattered and poorly aimed. For 20 minutes, Curdes owned the sky over Batan. Then he pulled up and saw something that didn't make sense. A large twin-engine plane was approaching the airfield from the east. At first, Curdes thought it might be a Japanese transport trying to land. But as he got closer, he saw American markings. A C-47, flying straight toward a Japanese airfield with its landing gear down. The C-47 belonged to the 39th Airlift Squadron, part of the 317th Troop Carrier Group. The unit was known as the Jungle Skippers. They flew supply runs all over the Pacific, usually without incident. The pilot that morning had taken off from Leyte heading for Manila with 8 passengers and a crew of 4. It should have been a routine 2-hour flight. But nothing went according to plan. The weather moved in fast. Heavy clouds and rain forced the pilot to fly by instruments. Then the radio died. No bearings. No weather updates. No communication with anyone. For almost 5 hours, the C-47 flew blind through storms. The pilot tried everything to get the radio working. Nothing. His navigator tried to calculate their position. The weather made it impossible. The fuel gauge dropped lower and lower. The passengers in back had no idea how bad things were. 2 of them were army nurses heading to Manila. The others were officers and enlisted men on routine transfers. They'd been in rough weather before. This seemed worse than usual, but nobody panicked. When the pilot finally came back to talk to them, his face was calm. He told them the radio was out and they were low on fuel. He'd find land soon and put the plane down. Nobody asked what would happen if the land they found was held by the Japanese. Maybe they didn't want to know. At 11:50 a.m., the pilot saw an island through a break in the clouds. And on that island, an airfield with a runway. To a pilot running on fumes with 13 people counting on him, it looked perfect. The runway was long enough for a C-47. The approaches looked clear. He couldn't see any planes or obvious military activity. He circled once, then dropped his landing gear and started his final approach. What the pilot couldn't see from altitude was that the airfield was very much active. Japanese troops were all over it. Anti-aircraft guns were tracking his every move. They'd been firing at American fighters just minutes before. And now, inexplicably, an American transport plane was trying to land in their laps. Above the C-47, Curdes watched in horror as the transport descended. He knew instantly what was happening. The crew was lost. They had no idea where they were. And in about 90 seconds, they were going to land on an enemy airfield, taxi to a stop, and get captured or killed. Curdes had to make a decision. He could try to signal the C-47 to pull up and follow him. But would they see him? Would they understand? The pilot was clearly focused on landing, and with no radio, there was no way to warn him. He could fire warning shots across the C-47's nose. But would the pilot interpret that as hostile fire or as an attempt to communicate? And if the pilot didn't respond fast enough, it would be too late. Or Curdes could do something that would almost certainly get him court-martialed. He could shoot down an American plane. Curdes dove toward the C-47. He positioned his Mustang in front of the transport and rocked his wings. The universal signal to follow me. The C-47 didn't respond. It just kept descending, now at about 150 feet above the water. Curdes could see the airfield ahead. He could see Japanese flak guns traversing, getting ready to fire. In a few seconds, the C-47 would be over land, and even if Curdes got through to them then, it would be too late to climb out. He fired a burst in front of the C-47's nose. Tracers cut through the air just ahead of the transport. The C-47 didn't alter course. Curdes thought fast. The pilot was so focused on landing that he probably thought the tracers were enemy fire coming from the island. That would just make him more determined to land quickly and get his passengers to safety. Time was up. Japanese guns on shore opened fire on Curdes. They weren't shooting at the C-47 because they thought it was about to surrender. The transport was now seconds from crossing the beach. Once it was over land, Curdes wouldn't be able to force it down safely. It would either land on the Japanese airfield or crash in the jungle. Either way, everyone on board would be lost. Curdes lined up directly behind the C-47. He could see people moving in the windows. He thought about what he was about to do. These were Americans, his own countrymen, probably scared, exhausted, grateful to see land. They had no idea what was about to happen to them, and Curdes was about to shoot them out of the sky. But he also knew what would happen if they landed. The Japanese didn't treat prisoners well. Pilots who'd been captured told stories that made veterans go quiet. And these passengers included women. Curdes had heard what happened to nurses who fell into Japanese hands. He made his choice. Curdes opened fire. His 650 caliber machine guns were hammered into the C-47's right engine. Metal tore away. Smoke poured out. The engine seized and stopped. The C-47 lurched but kept flying. The pilot was good. Curdes had to give him that. With one engine gone, a lesser pilot would have panicked and lost control. This one kept the plane level and steady, but he was still heading for the airfield. Curdes adjusted his aim and fired again. This time he hit the left engine. More smoke. More fire. The engine sputtered and died. Now the C-47 was a glider, and Curdes had put it in that condition deliberately. He just shot down a friendly aircraft. If he was wrong about any of this, his career was over. The C-47 pilot finally understood. With both engines dead, landing on the airfield was impossible. He banked away from shore and aimed for the ocean. Curdes watched, holding his breath. The pilot brought the C-47 down smoothly, nose up, tail low. The transport hit the water about 300 yards offshore. Spray erupted. The plane bounced once, settled, and floated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. People started climbing out onto the wings. Curdes counted. 4, 5, 6, 7. More kept coming. 10, 11, 12. The pilot and co-pilot were last. 13 people in total. All alive. All safe. Life rafts deployed. The crew started pulling people in. But they weren't out of danger yet. They were floating 300 yards from a Japanese-held island. Curdes could see enemy troops running toward the beach. Some had rifles. They started shooting at the life rafts. Bullets kicked up spray around the Americans. Louis Curdes, who'd been floating nearby in his own raft, paddled over to the C-47's crew and climbed aboard their raft. Now he could explain what had happened. Curdes dropped low over the life rafts and waggled his wings. He wanted the people below to know he was there, protecting them. Then he flew directly at the beach, his guns blazing. The Japanese scattered. Curdes made pass after pass, keeping the enemy pinned down. Every time they tried to get organized, he was there. But his fuel gauge was screaming. He'd been flying for hours. The air battle, the strafing runs, and now this. He was running on fumes. Schmidtke joined him. Together they had just enough firepower to keep the Japanese at bay for a few more minutes. But then they'd have to leave or crash into the ocean themselves. Curdes made the hardest call of the day. He couldn't stay. If he ran out of fuel, nobody would know where the survivors were. He had to get back to base, report what happened, and guide a rescue mission back. He dropped a message canister to the life rafts. It read, "Keep away from shore. Jupster, help is coming." The flight back to base at Mangaldan was tense. Curdes kept checking his fuel gauge. The needle was buried below empty. Mustangs could glide, but not far. Not over that much water. Somehow, the engine kept running. When Curdes finally touched down, the engine quit while he was still rolling. He'd flown on vapor alone for the last 10 minutes. His commanding officer was waiting. General George Kenney wanted to know what happened. Curdes explained. He'd shot down a friendly C-47 to prevent it from landing at a Japanese airfield. He'd disabled both engines. The plane had ditched at sea. All 13 people were alive but stranded just offshore of enemy territory. They needed rescue immediately. Most generals would have exploded. Shooting down a friendly aircraft was the kind of thing that ended careers and started courts-martial. But Kenney was different. He'd been in the Pacific since the beginning. He understood the chaos of war. And he understood that Curdes had made the only choice that made sense. He ordered an immediate rescue mission. A PBY flying boat would launch at dawn with Curdes as escort. That night, Curdes couldn't sleep. 13 Americans were floating in life rafts within rifle range of Japanese troops. If the rescue failed, if the Japanese captured them, Curdes would have accomplished nothing except extending their suffering. He went over the decision again and again. Had there been another way? Should he have tried harder to signal them? Could he have done something different? At dawn, Curdes took off with Schmidtke. They rendezvoused with a PBY and headed back to Batan. The sun was just coming up when they reached the area. Curdes spotted the life rafts immediately. They drifted about a mile from shore during the night. The Japanese had tried to reach them with small boats, but the Americans had paddled away each time. They were exhausted, cold, and terrified, but alive. The PBY landed on the water. It was a risky move. The plane was a sitting duck if Japanese fighters showed up. Curdes and Schmidtke circled overhead, watching for threats. The PBY taxied close to the life rafts and started pulling people aboard. It took agonizing minutes. The pilots helped the nurses first, then the wounded, then everyone else. Finally, LaCroix climbed aboard. The PBY turned and took off, spray flying. Back at Mangaldan, Curdes landed and walked to the PBY's parking spot. He wanted to see the people he'd saved. When they climbed out, most of them looked confused. They'd been told what happened, but the full story hadn't sunk in yet. A friendly pilot had shot them down to save them. It sounded insane. Then Curdes looked at the passenger manifest and froze. One of the nurses was named Valeria. He'd had a date with a nurse named Valeria the night before the mission. He'd canceled because of the early takeoff. Was it the same woman? He walked over to us. The woman stared at him. Curdes tried to think of something to say. Finally, he managed, "Sorry about canceling our date. And about shooting you down." The story spread through the base like wildfire. Curdes became an instant legend. A reporter from Air Force magazine interviewed him. The resulting article called it the strangest kill of the war. 7 German planes, 1 Italian, 1 Japanese, and 1 American. Curdes summed it up perfectly: 7 109s and 1 Macchi in North Africa, 1 Jap in the Pacific, and to top it, I have to go out and shoot down the girlfriend. General Kenny awarded Curdes an Air Medal for the incident. He also gave him credit for the kill, which Curdes painted on the nose of Bad Angel as an American flag. The citation praised his quick thinking and accurate shooting. But Kenny also added a personal note: "I hope you won't feel called on to repeat that performance." The C-47 crew had a different perspective at first. When they realized what almost happened, gratitude replaced confusion. They'd been seconds from landing at a Japanese airfield. Some of them had seen the flak guns on shore. They'd seen the troops running toward the beach. If they'd touched down on that runway, they would have been surrounded before they could even shut down the engines. Curdes hadn't shot them down. He'd saved them. The incident raised questions that went up the chain of command. How had a C-47 gotten so lost? Why didn't anyone know there was a Japanese airfield on Batan? What would have happened if Curdes hadn't been there? The answers were uncomfortable. Navigation in the Pacific was primitive. Weather could throw planes hundreds of miles off course. Radios were unreliable. And the Japanese held dozens of small islands that American intelligence had never properly mapped. This could easily happen again. The Army Air Forces changed several procedures. Transport pilots received better navigation training. Radio operators got backup equipment. And most importantly, before any transport flew over contested areas, fighters would scout the route. If the Batan airfield had been properly documented, the C-47 pilot would have known to avoid the area. But nobody could plan for every possibility. The Pacific was too big. The war was too chaotic. Pilots made decisions with incomplete information under impossible pressure. Sometimes they get lucky. Sometimes they didn't. Curdes got lucky twice that day. First, he happened to be in the right place at the right time. Second, his split-second decision to shoot worked out perfectly. What if he'd hesitated? What if he'd tried one more signal, one more warning burst? The C-47 would have landed. 13 Americans would have become prisoners. Some might have survived the war. Some wouldn't. The Japanese were unpredictable with prisoners. Sometimes they followed the rules. Sometimes they didn't. With the war going badly by 1945, Japanese commanders were getting desperate. Prisoners were often seen as burdens or sources of intelligence to be extracted by any means necessary. What if Curdes had missed? If his shots had hit the wrong part of the C-47, he could have killed everyone on board. A bullet in the wrong place could have ruptured the fuel tanks. The plane could have exploded. Or he could have damaged the control surfaces, sending the C-47 into an uncontrollable spin. His margin for error was razor thin. The incident became a case study in military decision-making. When is it acceptable to fire on friendly forces? The answer, military commanders decided, was when failure to act would result in certain capture or death. Curdes had faced exactly that situation. The textbooks were written later. In the moment, he just did what made sense. After the war, people asked Curdes if he'd do it again. He always said yes. The alternative was worse. Shooting down the C-47 was horrible, but letting it land would have been worse. War forced people to choose between bad options and worse ones. This was one of those moments. Curdes stayed in the Pacific until Japan surrendered. He flew more missions, attacked more targets, and never faced another decision quite like Batan. When the war ended, he went home to Indiana. In 1946, he married Valeria, the nurse from the C-47. The rumor that he married the woman he shot down became a popular story, though technically he married a woman who happened to be on a plane he shot down. The distinction seemed minor. Curdes stayed in the Air Force after the war. He flew in the Berlin airlift and served in the Korean War. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1963 and started a construction company. He rarely talked about the war, and when he did, he focused on the ordinary parts. The long flights, the bad food, the boredom between missions. But people wanted to hear about Batan. They wanted to hear about the impossible decision and the perfect shooting and the dramatic rescue. The truth was simpler than the legend. Curdes saw a problem, made a decision, and executed it. He didn't overthink it. He didn't second-guess himself until later. At that moment, he just acted. That's what separated good pilots from great ones. The ability to see what needed doing and do it, even when it seemed impossible or wrong. The C-47 pilot never flew that route again. He requested reassignment to a different theater. Some people said he couldn't handle the memory of almost landing at a Japanese airfield. Others said he just wanted a change of scenery. Either way, he finished the war without incident and went home. He never spoke publicly about what happened at Batan. The incident reveals something important about the Pacific War that often gets overlooked. The fighting gets remembered. The battles, the invasions, the carrier duels. But the Pacific Campaign was also a navigation nightmare fought across distances that boggled the mind. Pilots flew for hours over a featureless ocean with primitive instruments and unreliable radios. Getting lost wasn't unusual. It was routine. What was unusual was getting found again. American submarines patrolled specific areas so pilots knew where to look for rescue if they went down. The Navy established elaborate air-sea rescue procedures. Still, hundreds of pilots simply vanished. They ran out of fuel, ditched in the ocean, and were never seen again. They didn't get shot down. They just got lost. The Batan incident could have ended that way. Without Curdes, the C-47 would have landed, and 13 Americans would have disappeared into the Japanese prison system. Their families would have received telegrams saying they were missing. Years later, after the war, some of them might have shown up on prisoner lists. Or maybe not. The chaos of war erased people completely sometimes. Curdes prevented that. Not through heroics or brilliant strategy, but through quick thinking and accurate shooting. He saw a problem and fixed it in the only way available. That's worth remembering. The larger lesson is about decision-making under pressure. Curdes had seconds to decide. He couldn't consult anyone. He couldn't run the numbers or game out scenarios. He just had to choose and live with the consequences. Leaders face similar moments all the time, though usually with lower stakes. The principles are the same. Gather what information you can. Make the best decision you can. Act decisively. Deal with the results. Curdes got lucky. His decision worked. If it hadn't, we'd remember him differently. Maybe as the pilot who shot down a plane full of Americans by mistake. Maybe not at all. History remembers success and forgets failure. That's not fair, but it's reality. Curdes made the right call. 13 people lived because of it. That's what matters. When asked after the war which Allied commander the Germans feared most, German General Alfred Jodl didn't mention Eisenhower or Bradley. He said Patton, because Patton was unpredictable. When asked which American pilots the Japanese feared most, the answer varied. Some said the bomber crews could strike anywhere. Some said the carrier pilots who appeared without warning. But fighter pilots who'd fought in the Pacific gave a different answer. They feared the ones like Curdes, not the aces with 50 kills. The survivors who'd learned to make hard decisions and live with them. Those pilots were dangerous because they couldn't be intimidated or confused. They saw what needed doing and did it. Curdes lived until 1995. He was 75 years old. His obituary mentioned his war record, his family, and his business career. It noted that he was one of only 3 American pilots to score kills against all 3 Axis powers. And it mentioned Batan, the incredible story of the pilot who shot down an American plane to save its passengers. 50 years later, people still remembered. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's strangest incidents. If you want more stories about the impossible decisions that shaped the war, check out our video on the pilot who landed on an enemy carrier by mistake and survived. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be told.